Transitioning to College, Helping Late Adolescent Students Diagnosed with Autism Spectrum Disorder by Cole Whitaker. I chose this subject because personally I have a history of working with young adults and adolescents in the vocational industry. I've been a cosmetology teacher for the past 20 years. I've worked with students of diverse backgrounds, a lot of students with learning disabilities, and students who were autistic. And so when I went into going into more college, I was really interested in the future working with young adolescents as opposed to children. So when I started looking into the education world, I noticed that it was all focused on children and that there wasn't as much focus on how people learned when they were older adolescents or young adults. So that was something that I was really interested in. Also, I am a late diagnosed autistic person. I was just diagnosed in May, so that makes me particularly interested in this. Also, this adjustment period into college, it can be quite an adjustment going from high school to college for anyone, but it's specifically challenging for people who are diagnosed with ASD because change can be specifically difficult for them. For my project, what I'm looking at is what is being done for college students diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and what is not being done. And then one of my goals is to become an academic advisor. And when I become an academic advisor, what can I do as an academic advisor to help students who have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder in that transitional period from high school to college to make sure that they can be successful in college? The theorists that I looked at were Erik Erikson, Piaget, and B.F. Skinner. With the theorists, they're mostly discussing the developmental stages of a neurotypical adolescent. And so I had to look at how is it different for an adolescent who is on the spectrum. For a neurotypical adolescent, they are trying to figure out their identity, and often there's a lot of looking at their peers, whereas with someone on the spectrum, they may not pick up on social cues, so they may not feel as much peer pressure. They may just be doing their own thing the whole time. Or they may be extra sensitive because they may be extra aware that they're different. They're basically going to be in a different place. Either they may find their identity sooner or it may take them longer to find their identity. Now, as far as Piaget's formal operations has to do with, ability to theorize, hypothesize, think through things analytically. And people who are on the autism spectrum are very good at thinking about things analytically. In fact, that would be a strength of theirs usually because they tend to think of things very black and white terms. So in some ways, they can be very advanced as far as this goes. But one thing that they tend to struggle with is theory of mind or the ability to see the world through someone else's eyes. So in some ways, they could be advanced in formal operations, where in other ways, they could be a little bit behind. And lastly, I chose B.F. Skinner because ABA, which stands for Applied Behavioral Analysis, is the most widely used therapy for children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and it is based on B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. So I felt that was applicable. When I researched best practices as far as academic advising is concerned, I found some advice on the website for the Global Community for Academic Advising, specifically for dealing with students that have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Establish trust and prepare students for unexpected changes. People on the spectrum can have difficulty with change, and they do really well with routine. And so giving them a lot of information about what changes are going to happen can be very helpful. Recommend classes that don't require group projects. Groups work can be difficult for people on the spectrum because they have difficulty with nonverbal cues and social communication. Prepare students for tests. Give them information about the test. Find out if they can be seated in a place where there's less distractions, or if they maybe need more time for the test, can advocate on behalf of the student and their needs. Seek an effective way of communicating with them. You may need to communicate with them in a different way than you communicate with other students. You may need to use more visual things. You may need to use more charts. They may prefer to communicate more via email. They may not like talking on the phone. Every student's going to be different. Some of the things they may have challenges with that they may need help with is time management, organization skills, note-taking strategies. These are things that some people take for granted that everyone knows how to do. Some people need to be taught how to do them. Students on the autism spectrum may need to be checked in on a little bit more often. You need to monitor their progress. Pay attention to behaviors. And when you're discussing things, you need to make sure that you're using words that are literal, clear, and concise. Use concrete language. You don't want to be vague. You don't want to use metaphors because that can be challenging for students with ASD. And then recommend a tutor or a mentor possibly who can help them to model appropriate academic or organizational or interpersonal skills. Consider accommodations. They could get accommodations with a lot of different things, and that's usually done through the Disability Center at the college. However, they may not be aware of the Disability Center. They may need help with how to communicate with the Disability Center. You may need to advocate with them by helping them communicate with the Disability Center. For my research, this first study, I was very excited to be able to use because I'd actually read the study before and it has a very long title. But long story short, this study was a study about autistic burnout, and it was a study that interviewed autistic adults and their experience with autistic burnout. The purpose of the research was to get information from actual autistic adults' experience, as opposed to a lot of research on ASD is from observing people diagnosed with ASD, whereas in this research, it's from the perspective of the experience of someone living with it, which I thought was very interesting. And how it was conducted was through interviews. And what they found was that autistic burnout was something that pretty much everyone experienced. And in some situations, they specifically asked people about it, but there were some people they interviewed where they didn't specifically ask them about it, but it came up anyways, which I thought was very interesting. And one of the other interesting finds was that one of the things that autistic people thought caused burnout was masking. And masking is when someone who is autistic basically has to hide their autistic traits and act like they're not autistic. And so for someone who is going from high school to college, this could be a situation where they could possibly end up with autistic burnout when they are coming into a situation with a lot of change and they have to hide a lot of their autistic traits. The second study that I looked at was about increasing social integration for college students with autism spectrum disorder. This was a very small study, but it was very interesting. The purpose of the research was to look at students diagnosed with ASD at a college level and taking those students, and first they looked at a baseline. They looked at how much social interaction they had, how many social activities they had in a week, and then they met with them. They kind of asked them what they were interested in. They worked with them. They had them work with a mentor and sort of sent them to social activities with a mentor. That was the intervention. And then after the follow-up, they looked at whether or not that intervention helped increase their social interaction. And what was really interesting is not only did the intervention help the social interaction, but that social increase actually increased all of the participants' academic performance across the board, which I thought was great. So, looking at all of this together, some of the things that I thought were interesting, the best practice information was really good, but it doesn't really talk at all about social factors, which can be important to think about because the study mentioned that social integration affects academics. So that is something that's important to look at. And also, autistic burnout is something that could affect schooling. For academic advisors, they didn't bring it up at all, probably because they don't know about it. Theories for development, they don't discuss specifically what do these theories have to do with how someone with ASD develops. So that's something that if a neurotypical person develops like this, what are the challenges for someone with ASD and how does it then look different? Looking at the research, what we see is that some of the things that are specifically challenging and different and difficult are social interactions. When we look at the research of the social intervention, with social intervention, the social interaction got better, the academics got better, but they needed that intervention. Before the intervention, there wasn't a lot of social interaction, and their academics were failing. So that sort of shows you that as far as the social development of adolescents with ASD is probably going to be slower than their neurotypical counterparts. And as far as burnout goes, someone with ASD may need more accommodations because of autistic burnout. So, as far as practical implications go, as a future academic advisor, I can be thinking about social integration and how important that is, and can possibly ask questions and make suggestions about how a student with ASD can socially integrate. And also, being diagnosed myself, I kind of have an understanding of what sort of social activities would be a little easier for someone on this spectrum or more sort of appropriate and maybe a little less anxiety inducing. And then understanding burnout and things that can help prevent burnout can be taken into consideration when suggesting classes to take or ways to deal with the pressures of a caseload of classes. And then also in the future, when I complete my master's degree, I would like to be a professor. So understanding this as a professor, I can help design my classes and projects with all this information in mind so I can make my classes more accessible to students with ASD. Resources. The first link that I have is the Advising Best Practices. The second link that I have is Dr. Raymaker's professional website. That's the doctor that did the study on autistic burnout. And Dr. Raymaker also put together a group called Aspire. And Aspire is a group for late diagnosed autistic adults. This website has resources for them. The next link is the link to the social integration study. The last link is Landmark College. This is a college on the East Coast, which is actually a college designed specifically for neurodiverse students diagnosed with ASD, ADD. They specifically cater to those types of students, which I think is super awesome. They also offer some professional development classes where you can get graduate certificates in teaching students that are neurodiverse. Looking back on this project, what was challenging is that I'm choosing to research about students that are not neurotypical. So when I was looking at the theories, of course, the theories aren't going to talk about people with ASD. So it was challenging to really think about, okay, how does this relate to students with ASD? But it was also really interesting. One of the things that was also difficult is that there's a lot of research about ASD, but all that research is on children. There's very little research specifically on college age or adults. One of the things that was easier is I'm so interested in it, and I've actually been researching it even before I started this degree. So I kind of already had some studies that I had already read that I was kind of like, ooh, can I use this? Because I was already really excited about it. And one of the things that I think is going to be a real success is that there's a lot of this that can be very applicable for me in my future profession and for me personally, which I find very exciting. I hope this didn't go too long. Thanks for listening to my presentation.